Okay, we're live. Welcome and good afternoon. Welcome to our fifth and final day of our Get Educated Week of Action. If you've been following along, we've had a lot of great topics during the week. And today our topic is for people who care about schools, it's important to vote local. And with me today is New York City mom and author and education activist, Alina Adams. And Alina, I'm just going to turn it over to you and let you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about the work that you do.
Well, that was quite a great introduction to start with. I am a New York City mom. I have 3 kids. I like to say the oldest is in college. No, actually, the oldest one is back in my apartment. Then, because they sent him home in March and announced that he'd be remote for the rest of the year. I have another child who is a junior in high school and a daughter who is in 8th grade. I have been writing about New York City education for over a decade now. I have a book called Getting into NYC Kindergarten and a book called Getting into NYC High School. If you want to know why I don't have a book called Getting into NYC Middle School, it's because middle school is a whole other animal in New York City. I blog weekly at New York School Talk. I've written for Education Post. I've written editorials for the New York Post, the New York Daily News, the 74. I'm also, in my spare time, as I laugh, I'm also an author. I write fiction as well. And people laugh at me, say, oh, you write fiction and then you write about New York City schools. Well, New York City schools sometimes is a truth is stranger than fiction kind of thing. I have a novel called The Nesting Dolls out right now. But here today, I want to talk about New York City schools in particular, not just during this time, not just during a pandemic, not just during COVID, but in general, because as I keep telling parents, eventually the world will stop being on fire and education will still be a critical issue.
Right, absolutely. And I think to start out today, I have a lot of friends that teach in New York City, and something that something that I noticed right off the bat with them is that they talk about education very differently than a lot of other teachers from other states. And New York City is just a different animal. So first, let me say I appreciate you coming on and clearing this up for a lot of people and talking a little bit about how it works and what voters need to pay attention to. Now, at the beginning of this year, you wrote a post for Education Post that talked a little about parents that you meet with and their concerns about Secretary of Education Betsy DeVos and why they are so upset and want to know how she and her policies are going to impact their local schools. And I thought you had an interesting story to tell about that as it applies to where our focus should be as parents when we're thinking about ed policy and ed funding.
You're absolutely right. I have been doing for about 12 years now. I've been doing getting into NYC kindergarten or getting into NYC high school workshops. But it was only 4 years ago that I suddenly started getting the question, well, what about Betsy DeVos and what is she going to do to our schools? And my response up to this point has been, first, tell me who the previous Secretary of Education was, and then tell me what I've given you a clue, I've eliminated 50% of the population, did that affected your child's school. And I have yet to get an answer, because the fact of the matter is, prior to Betsy DeVos, the majority of people, of course, there were always geeks like us who knew who the Secretary of Education was. But the majority of parents, even parents who cared quite a bit about their child's education, didn't know who the Secretary of Education was. And they certainly didn't know what the Secretary of Education did that applied to their child and their child's particular school. So with all due respect to Arne Duncan, whose book I read and reviewed and found a lot of interesting things about it, and to his successor, John King, that's the answer to the first question, who was the John King Jr., who was the Secretary of Education. The fact of the matter is, your child's daily education, your child's school is much, much, much more affected, can I say much too many times, by local government and state government than it is by the federal government on almost a logarithmic scale.
Wow. And, and we talked a lot this week about all the noise that comes with national elections and the appointees that then come from those people and their platforms, and how we're all really hyper-focused on that level, maybe just because that's what we hear about most often. But there's all these other offices in New York City and across the country that people really should be watching. And so how does this play out in New York, and which offices are impacting the parts of education that parents really want to care about?
Well, first off, let's start with the fact that New York City has mayoral control of the schools. That's not true. Nationally, New York City has mayoral control. It actually came about when Michael Bloomberg, speaking of other national candidates that came and went, when Michael Bloomberg, he got mayoral control of the schools. So right now, our Mayor Bill de Blasio, has controls of the schools. He doesn't answer to a school board. It's all on him. He appoints the chancellor. The current chancellor, Richard Carranza, came to us from Houston and San Francisco. That was a political appointment. We also have issues with the fact that some New York school state law, like best known is the test for the specialized high schools admissions, the SHSAT, is actually state law. So it's something that no matter how many times the mayor and the chancellor have said they'd like to get rid of it, they actually can't. That has to be done at the state level. So that's connected to the state assembly and the state senate. So that's something that happens at the state level that affects the local level. We also have community education councils where some members are elected, but some members are appointed by the borough president. We have the panel for education policy, several panels for education policy, where the bulk of the membership is appointed by the mayor, some by borough presidents. So the fact of the matter is, even though we have mayoral control, borough president matters because they can appoint people to these councils. Also at the state level, in addition to the SHSAT, at the state level, we also have the question of charter schools and how many charter schools can open in the city. So the fact of the matter is, city and state control, as I said earlier, is much, much of a bigger player when it comes to what school your child can attend and even what kind of education your child will get there. Because something else that is affected by the local level is, for instance, gifted and talented programs. Should we have more? Should we have less? That's on the mayor. Screened middle and high schools, that's on the mayor. State tests and how they're used, that's on the mayor, and it comes from the state, because even though we do have the federal piece, we have the fact that the federal government says that states must give tests, and there is the Common Core. There is also a lot of freedom of what the states can add and take away from the state tests, and the city also has a lot of freedom of what curriculum they can create to meet the state tests. So once again, the mandate might come from the federal level, but the devil in the details is at the state level and at the city level.
Now that is a lot. When I think about Pennsylvania and I think about all of the people that we need to pay attention to here, it seems like far, far fewer people have to be on my radar in terms of education policy. So an average parent in New York trying to manage this and trying to navigate their kids through school, how do they know which person to pay attention to and what they're supposed to be looking for in terms of a candidate that is going to do right by them and their kids in the schools?
Well, to be fair, different parents are going to have different priorities. So it's not as if every parent has to be focused on every issue. The fact of the matter is, if you no longer have children in elementary school, there are going to be some issues that are not going to be important to you. And the fact is, if you are planning to go to a charter school, you might not care as much about where district public school zones are drawn. So to start with, not every parent has to care about every issue. I don't say they shouldn't. I'm just saying, rather than, as you said, it's so big and so overwhelming, rather than trying to master everything, you might want to do it a level at a time. Actually, when I talk to parents who are trying to find a school, one of the things that I tell them is you really only want to look for the first couple of years. If you're looking for kindergarten, look for the school that has the best kindergarten and early years program. Don't be blown away by the high school, even if the school might go up to 12th grade, because A, you're not there yet. B, you might decide that your child, what you thought he needed at 4 is not what she needed at 12. That's the other piece. So it's the same thing kind of here when you're looking at the political piece. Look at what affects you. I know this is a very selfish way to do it, but the fact of the matter is, if you don't want to be overwhelmed, as you said, it's so much and you don't want to be overwhelmed, start with the pieces that are important to you. For instance, if you really care about an issue like school zoning, which is valid for elementary schools, and where your child will go. In New York City, a child isn't guaranteed a spot at their zone school. Some of the most popular schools are overcrowded, so it goes to lottery. So if that's the issue you care about, then that, of course, the mayor is always in play. But there's also community education councils that have a bit of a say on how that's going to be happening with rezoning and programs about either moving kids or moving schools or all sorts of things. So that's what you need to know. As I said, if you're interested in the screening for gifted and talented programs in elementary school, or for honors programs in middle schools, or for different types of high schools, that's completely up to the mayor. Even though I must say in New York City, our mayor is always surprised when we remind him of that, because the mayor just has a tendency to throw up his hands and go, oh, there is nothing I can do. And then we go, you do realize that with the stroke of a pen, you who is so upset about screened schools, because now his children have already graduated from screened schools. And now that his children have graduated from screened schools, he's come to the epiphany that they're immoral. Also, now that his children have graduated from private schools, he's had the same epiphany. So, but he's very surprised to hear that apparently they're under his control, because he just throws up his hands. Well, I tried, but all those other racist parents, they stopped me. So that's on the mayor. As I said, if you are interested in the charter piece, that's a combination of both the mayor and the state, because the state does say how many charter schools you can have, but the mayor has to do with space allocation, which has been a big issue for charters. Also, community education councils very often come out against charter schools. So they're a piece that you need to be aware of as well. And as I said earlier in conversation, if the specialized high school exam is something that you're concerned about, then that's actually at the state level. That's your assembly members, that's your state senators. So I realize I didn't simplify the process. You said, how can I make this simpler? There's so many. And I said, yes, there are. Here they all are. But I guess the tip that I can offer, take it in stages. See what it is that you're coming up against or into. I don't mean to make it confrontational. It doesn't have to be against. It can be leaning in. But see what stage particularly of life and education affects you and go from there.
Right. And, you mentioned the politicians that suddenly they live one reality, and then when it comes time to making policy for the rest of us, they live another reality.
Yes.
Is this something that parents
with so many of them in New York City? It's really just a smorgasbord.
And I've seen that you've written about not only our politicians, but also the celebrity faces that come out or and advocate. Yes. And in the city.
Matt Damon really, really, really believes in public schools, but there was not a single public school in New York City that fit what he wanted for his children. So while he sent his children to private schools, he really, really, really believes in public schools for you and believes everyone should go to their local zone school. But his local zone school was just not a good fit for his girls. You understand? It's just one of those things. The odds of that happening are astronomical. So really, it only happened to him. Oh, and to Cynthia Nixon, who really, really, really believes everyone should go to their zone public school, except for her children, where, it was just not a good fit. But that's because her children are special. And most children will do just fine at their local zone school. This applies to multiple politicians too. We have Brad Lander in Brooklyn. We have our own Chancellor Carranza, who actually, when he was chancellor in San Francisco, his daughter went to Lowell High School. I happen to know Lowell High School because I also went to Lowell High School. I'm much older than his daughter, but I know the school. It's a screened school. I guess it wasn't immoral then, but screened schools are immoral now.
Right. Now, is this something that parents should be aware of when they're looking at policy that's coming?
Yes, absolutely. Because so often we are faced with do as I say, not what I do. And you can actually read a candidate's statement. For instance, screen schools are immoral. Everyone should go to their zone school. But how much can you believe that they believe what they're saying if they did something different? I mean, again, I mentioned school chancellor. Forget the fact where he sent his own daughter. When he was chancellor in San Francisco, he announced that getting rid of algebra in 8th grade was going to help all, especially minority students, because it would be the great equalizer. Now, let's ignore the fact that the NAACP has named San Francisco the worst county in California for Black students. He was going to fix that by getting rid of algebra in 8th grade. Now, the fact of the matter is, any family who could afford to get their child to privately take algebra in 8th grade still went ahead and did it, and so everything went on. But when he came to New York, he announced Algebra for All initiative, which meant that algebra for every student in 8th grade would get rid of inequality and help raise achievement. So it's a little difficult to believe that he believes the words coming out of his mouth when he has done two such completely different things. Now, people can change their minds. The fact of the matter is, he could have seen what happened in San Francisco and said, oh, I made a mistake. That does happen. I'm not saying people can't make a mistake. I realized that was wrong. Here is now the right thing to do. But that's not what he did. He did both things with a straight face, I presume, saying this is going to help. So to answer your question as to why parents should be aware of this hypocrisy is, I think it's very difficult to believe that this politician is saying this is the best policy for other people's children when they did not do the same thing for their own.
Right. And it plays a little bit into our conversation yesterday we had about trust and you know, are the people trustworthy that we're putting out there to make decisions for kids and communities? And I think that that's a really telling piece of evidence to say, what do you do versus what do you say?
Right. And that's been the one sort of note I've been singing over and over again, is it's difficult to debate the subject in good faith with the politicians if you know that what they did went against what they're saying. So you're absolutely 100% right. It's a matter of trust. You know, to quote the great philosopher Billy Joel, is that it's a matter of trust in your elected officials. You're supposed to believe they have your best interests at heart. How can you believe they have your best interests in heart when that's not what they did for the people whose interests you kind of know they have above ours? I mean, I'm pretty sure Bill de Blasio cares more about Dante and Chiara than he does about my own children, which is beyond fine. It would be weird if he didn't. But the fact of the matter is that when he wanted to do what was best for his children, he did A, and now he insists that not only should I do B, but I should be grateful that he is forcing me to do B.
Yeah, that doesn't sit right, you know, and it's important to know. And I would imagine there's a lot of parents who don't dig that deep when it comes to figuring out who is going to get their support in local elections. Why do you think that that parents should, you know, or maybe a better question is, where do you think parents should spend their energy when they're really trying to, other than their stage that they're in? If I'm a parent and I want to put a little energy out, how do I best focus my energy around local voting in New York to make sure that I'm getting the absolute best?
Well, first of all, see who is in charge of the things that you're concerned about. Sometimes it's very difficult to follow the trail to see who actually has the final word on it. Like an example being, if you were truly concerned with the SHSAT, the specialized high school test, yes, the mayor matters. Yes, the chancellor matters, but you should really see what the people who you're sending to Albany think on the subject. So it's a matter of finding that out. If you're talking about charter schools, same thing. Of course, the mayor matters. Of course, the chancellor matters. But again, that's more of a state issue. If you're particularly concerned about what's on the curriculum, because the fact of the matter is, there was an NPR study a couple of years ago that said in a given classroom, and this is nationwide, not just in New York, in a given classroom, 50% of the kids are performing above the material that's being put in front of them. That doesn't mean that the teachers are doing such a great job that the teachers are performing above grade level. It means that the material is dumbed down. So if you actually care about the material that your child is studying, that is very much a school chancellor and a mayor issue. We had a case a couple of years ago in New York City where the chancellor prior to Richard Carranza, Carmen Farina, she was a huge fan of dual language programs, which in New York City basically means you take the same curriculum, but you either teach, half the day in one language, half the day in the other, or half the day, or some of the subjects in one language, or some of the subjects in the other, or one day in one language, one the other. But it's a dual language program. She was a huge fan. She opened about 40 new programs a year. So if dual language is a really important thing for you, and it is, there's some parents who keep wanting to add more languages. Like right now, the majority of them are English and Spanish, but there's, English and French, and parents have lobbied to add English and Italian, English and Russian, English and Yiddish, English and Urdu, English and Japanese. So that's a huge piece of the New York City educational school choice. And, here's the thing. New York has an embarrassment of riches when it comes to school choice, in the sense of we have public schools, we have charter schools, we have private schools, we have parochial schools. The public schools have G&T programs and dual language programs and all sorts of things. So we do have quite a bit of choice, although some people tend to not acknowledge it. But that's a separate piece. But if, for instance, you are interested in dual language, if that's what you want, then what you really want to know is, what does the mayor think of it? What does the chancellor? But also geographically, you want to get support from your community, because usually those language programs are on a district level, or they're on a borough level. Sometimes they're citywide, sometimes they're open to a district, sometimes they're just zoned. So you also want to know what, for instance, city council members who might be on your side about dual language programs, community education council members. So depending on what it is that you're interested in, you should first find out who has both the final say, but also who can push it. Because maybe the city council member doesn't have the final say. That needs to be signed off on by the mayor. But is the city council the person who should go to the mayor and keep saying, my constituents want a dual language French program, my constituents want a dual language Italian program. So don't just find out who has to sign the documents, find out who's the person who can lobby for them to sign the documents.
Yeah, I think that's a really good testament to why the vote local focus is important, because the closer to the community it seems that a person can advocate, the more likely that they're going to be able to have some influence higher up, to that person who does sign the paper and put the policy in action.
Right, because if you can't get to the mayor, find out who you have to get to, who can get to the mayor.
Right. So I think it drives it home that, the education council folks maybe are the first ones that our people are looking to, that say, all right, what are you concerned with? What are your positions on these topics, and how can you help me?
Yes.
To advocate for my school. Certainly
you want to find out their positions, because it comes down to, even with things like the Community Education Council, even with schools like things like the Panel for Education Policy, even with city council members, even though they don't have the vote in the state for the state issues, they can gather up grassroots support to say, well, my community is pro this or is anti that. So that's the other piece, is that even if they don't have direct effect, they certainly have an opportunity to speak for their communities, and also to speak to those people in their communities who do have the direct effect.
Right. So there are some really huge issues around equity and opportunity in New York. So if I'm a parent in New York City, and that's a concern for me, equitable schools and opportunity for all kids, and I want my kid to be in a diverse setting, and I want, all of those things that come along with it. What are the things that I need to be paying attention to when it comes to elections? What are the buzzwords, maybe?
Well, if you're the mayor and certain city council people, you just announce that you really want your children to be in diverse schools, but then throw up your hands and go, but I didn't understand how to make that happen. So I had to send them to the whitest and wealthiest school in my district, because I did not understand how the city works. I could have helped. I help people all the time. I help them figure out how to do that. So assuming that you do not fall back to that sarcastic response that I just made, and I apologize. It just makes me very angry.
I hear you.
I'm a very angry person, and it comes out in sarcasm. So assuming that you are not a hypocrite, assuming you're a genuine parent who actually wants that, then one of the things parents have been able to do is parents have been able to organize on a grassroots level, honestly. Parents have been able, some parents have gone as far as to open schools for which the admissions would be either based on free lunch status or geography or things like that. Parents have certainly worked together with the school itself, because here's the other thing, a school can decide how to affect their admissions a little bit. There have been some schools who it's within the school community. You want to talk about really hyper-local? Let's talk about the school community. Let's talk about the PTA. Let's talk about groups of parents in schools, in PTAs organizing and saying, we want our school to be a more diverse community. So let's do outreach to a neighborhood that perhaps never before considered coming to our schools. Let's talk about formally changing the policy that we set aside, let's say 40% of the seats in our school for children who qualify for free lunch or English language learners or are in foster care. I mean, you do have that kind of wiggle room. So the fact is, on the most hyper-local level, schools can do it themselves. Schools then can also go up a little bit higher. Like, let's say you want to try to change the demographics in a given district. A community education council can pass resolutions to say every school, let's say every middle school in this district will set aside X number of seats, as I said, for low-income kids or for children who got 1s and 2s on their state tests. So we're still at the local level. We haven't even really needed to bother with the mayor, and we certainly haven't needed to go up to the state. So if you're a parent who's concerned about that particular piece, well, okay, I'll be honest. Here's the thing. Everything I say tends to sound sarcastic, but I'm not. I'm genuinely sincere. If you are truly a parent, by which I mean a parent of means, who could send their child to any school, and your real true concern is equity issues and diversity, the first and most basic thing you can do is send your child to a lower performing school. But that's usually not what parents want to do. What parents want to do is they want to be guaranteed that they will still get a seat at their high performing school, and some other parent's kid will step aside to offer a seat to a child from outside the community. That is often what happens when people say they want a more diverse school environment. What they mean is, I'd like to stay where I am, but could somebody else please leave to offer room so that my child can go to school in a diverse environment? And I can say, I had a meeting with a gentleman who I will not name, but he runs a charter network, and a charter network that's very big on having their, I believe, diverse by design and intentionally integrated and all of that. And he asked me, from all the parents that you work with, what do parents want from an integrated school? And my response, in all honesty, was they want to say that their child goes to an integrated school. What they would like is the school to be exactly as it was and exactly what they want it to be, but they want to be able to say that they go to an integrated school. So the short answer to that question is, first take the step yourself. Before you start telling other people what to do, and before you start going to the government level, the most basic thing you can do actually is you and your group of friends who really, really believe in public schools and wish they were more integrated. You can all go, you can be the integrators. You don't have to put this is another thing. You don't have to put the burden on children of color to go 30 blocks from where they live to come to your school where they will be in the minority. You could do that. You could go 30 blocks uptown and you could have your child be the child who's in the minority. But that's not what people mean.
Right. It seems like that's every parent, right? So like every parent is saying, not my child, but maybe yours.
Yes, exactly. We're back to Cynthia Nixon and Matt Damon and Brad Lander and everybody else. This is what other people's children should do, but mine might get upset. We don't want that.
Right. And so that seems like the core of a lot of those problems is it's good for you, but not for me. And how do we solve it if you're not willing to take the step yourself? If you're not willing to give something up in order for the community to gain, then what? Yeah. That's problematic. And what about another issue I see you write about a lot is transparency in terms of how to get in to some schools.
Yes. Yes. Well, the fact of the matter is there's different ways of applying to different schools, and it comes down to one of two ways. One is supposed to be a straight lottery, which means everyone has as much of a shot as anybody else. And one is what actually another thing that Chancellor Carranza loves to talk about is holistic admissions. When he's talking about how much he, excuse me, he dislikes the SHSAT, he says, well, if you were to apply to Harvard, Harvard wouldn't just go by one test score. Harvard would go by holistic admissions. They look at your extracurriculars, and there might be an interview, and there might be a portfolio. And there are middle schools and high schools in New York City who do holistic admissions. Well, here's the thing. When your child gets a score on a test and doesn't get into a school, and another child who got a lower score on the test got into a school, assuming a few other factors like how they ranked it are all the same, you can go and you can say, explain this to me. This makes no sense. When a school internally, secretly ranks students based on an algorithm that is known only to them, that is when you have all sorts of string pulling. I mean, what are the odds? There's a school on the Upper West Side of New York, which is actually citywide, but it's a middle school, but all other middle schools in New York City start in 6th grade, and you have to go through a centralized process where all kids go through the DOE, and they have to fill out an application, and then an algorithm sorts them. First of all, this school starts in 5th grade, which means the kids do an end run around, it's not the kids, let's be honest, it's the parents. The kids at this point are not making these decisions. The parents do an end run. The school judges kids based on interviews and other factors, and it's citywide. What are the odds, that the children of Cynthia Nixon and Louis C.K. and Samantha Bee happens to get into the school when it was just a completely random algorithm, and really any child has as much of a shot as any other child? And then the school is very surprised to say, we don't really know why we're so white and so wealthy, but this is just what happens. We wish, like the mayor and the chancellor, we really wish our school was more diverse, but we cannot for the life of us figure out a way how to do it. So when you're talking about a school that has its own metrics, how do you counter? You counted the metrics wrong when you don't know what the metrics are. So that's one piece of the equation. And the other thing is schools hold wait lists. Basically, the first placement process is done randomly, allegedly, by an algorithm, but then each school holds their own wait list. And as I tell parents, if anyone tells you that those wait lists follow a straight queue, they're lying, either to you or to themselves. Because I personally have worked with parents where I've told them what to say to call a school and get them to jump a queue. So when you're talking about that kind of holistic admissions, you are definitely talking about an unfair system. There's just no way to get around that.
Wow. So there are so many other elements that parents need to be thinking about when they're thinking about looking for candidates who have realistic visions of what school could be, whether it be, equity or fairness in terms of admissions. And there's some pieces about magnet schools as well in New York. What are the equity and diversity issues around magnet schools like?
Well, it's a tricky piece of the language, excuse me, because magnet schools in a lot of other areas sometimes can be selective. They can be either based on grades or test scores and things like that. When New York City magnet schools are a little bit different. New York City magnet schools are schools that can usually just take outside the zone or outside of the district. I think the correct language for New York City would be talking about unzoned schools. Like some schools are not just dependent on your address. Some schools are not dependent on your district. Like I mentioned, the Center School, that's a school that even though it's on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, can in theory accept children from all around the city. You can also have in a lot of New York City is broken up into boroughs. Boroughs are broken up into districts, and districts are broken up into zone. A zone school means just a school based on your child's address. But what often happens is you might have schools that are called unzoned schools, in which any child from the district has as much of a shot as any other child. So the fact of the matter is, in the beginning, when a lot of these schools were first being set up, these schools were allowed to act like private schools. They were actually allowed to interview students. They were allowed to interview parents. Then one of the things that Bloomberg actually did when he got mayoral control, as we spoke about earlier, is he made it so the schools were no longer allowed to do that. They had to take through straight lottery. Yet I have parents tell me all the time, they say, I came in for an open house. Remember open houses in the past when we could go places and touch things and be around people? So that is something people would do. And they would go to an open house at this school that's supposed to take you just based on lottery. And they'd be handed a questionnaire asking things like, what can you contribute to the school? And the schools would say, oh, it's just for statistics. Obviously, it doesn't matter. One mother said to me, this was extremely invasive. They sent me a questionnaire saying, was your child breastfed? Was your child adopted? She's like, what does this have to do with the fact that this is a school that I'm supposed to get into through lottery? So what's magnet schools, a lot of places would be more likely to be an unzoned school. And once again, the initial placement process is done by an algorithm through the DOE. But then the wait lists are held by the schools. And in that case, it just becomes a free-for-all. Do I know you? Do I like you? Did you come in? Were you charming? Do you know someone in the school? Do you know the teacher? Do you know the principal? And look, what do you know? Suddenly you're in the school.
Right. Wow. There's just such a web of things that we have to be concerned about. And I'm thinking of one more really important player when it comes to politics around schools, and that's teachers' unions. So what does the average parent need to know about teachers' unions and how they impact the interplay of all of these things happening?
Well, first of all, that's a fantastic question. Second of all, I want to mention that the mayor is the one who negotiates with the teachers' union. So that's something you have to keep in mind. Is this a mayor who has made it clear they're going to hold a hard line, or is this a mayor who's going to give the unions what they want? So that's the first piece. The mayor's office does the negotiation with the teachers' unions. It's also very difficult because parents have no say in who runs the teachers' union. It's not like parents get to, but it's a professional union. Here's a question that I have. Every other union in the world, and I'm a member of a few myself, every other union in the world is proud to stand up and say, we work for our members. Our purpose is to get the best deal we can for our members. That's what we do. The teachers' union says we work for the client. The teachers' union says when we negotiate, it's not for our own good. It's for your children's own good. Well, what if your children's own good doesn't mesh with their own good? They're a union. They should be fighting for their own good, but I wish they'd admit it. That's the issue that I have. Also, just as a side notion, despite belonging to the Writers Guild of America, I have worked on many television shows that have been canceled. And when the television shows were canceled, I was not paid to do nothing. I don't even understand how that works. This is honestly a point of ignorance, not sarcasm. I don't know. Are there any other unions where when the place where you work closes down or you are fired, you continue getting paid? I'm genuinely asking. I don't know. Are there other unions? And the response is, well, if a school closes, that's not the teacher's fault. Well, when a show I was writing got canceled, it was a little bit my fault. It was everybody's fault, but it wasn't all my fault. So that is just a logic I don't understand. So first, you definitely want to know where the mayor stands on that piece of it. We're talking about the rubber rooms and teachers continuing being paid even though they're not teaching and all of that. So I think rather than knowing about the union's stand, because parents really have no control over that, what they need to know is where their elected officials stand vis-a-vis dealing with the unions.
Right. Yeah, that's all really important. And gosh, I just had something that left my mind real quickly, but I think you made some great points there about, who is the union working for? And you're right. I agree with you, was working for, and even coming from, being a former teacher and coming from a union background, the union is working for the teachers.
But it should be. That's what I'm saying. Yeah. That's not something to be ashamed of. That's what a union was formed to do. We all saw the movie Newsies, They were
Right.
formed to protect the newspaper boys. They didn't claim, the newsies, as they were singing and dancing, claimed they were working for the boys selling newspapers, not the people reading the newspaper. They didn't claim
Right.
that's what they were doing it for. That's where my confusion comes from. And I will tell you right now is in New York City, where, of course, like so many other places, we're in the heat of, do we reopen schools? Do we not reopen schools? Which schools do we open? Which schools do we not? Oh, you want to talk about voting local? Here's what's been going on here just the last 2 weeks. This is fun. So we have had some areas, some neighborhoods where the COVID positivity rates have been spiking. So the mayor said, I'm going to close schools on such and such a date in these areas. The governor lipped in to say, no, I'm going to close schools on this day in such and such areas. The mayor, then they put out different maps. That's the whole thing. They put out two different sets of maps. The mayor had one set of maps. The governor had they overlapped in some places, but they weren't complete. There were places where the line would literally go down the middle of the street. Okay, so the people on this side of the street are in danger of contaminating. The people across the street are not. So they put out two different sets of maps. It was definitely a measuring contest of something. The mayor said, I'm going to close schools Wednesday. The governor said, no, it's going to be Tuesday. The city policy for COVID, I'm not trying to remember the exact name of the plan, but it's their COVID plan. It has an official name, says that 14 days after a school is closed, because everyone has self-quarantined, students can come back. Yesterday, was it yesterday? Time moves quickly and education news comes quickly. So yesterday or the day before, the governor went on TV to announce which schools would be open, which schools would remain closed. City Hall claims he didn't tell them what he was going to say until he came on television. Now, the DOE is saying, oh, we have no control over what schools are going to be open. And the response is, no, actually, the governor said this area can reopen. You can decide how you're going to reopen it. So that's another thing when we're talking about hyperlocal. I don't know how you can control for this. But when the mayor and the governor are each really trying to show which one of them is the bigger boy, who gets screwed? The students, because I have parents who have no idea if basically the schools closed on Thursday. As of Wednesday, some parents had not even received phone calls telling them whether or not their schools would be closed. And principals were claiming they didn't hear from the DOE whether their school would be closed. And right now, what I'm hearing from principals is the DOE said to them, we have a plan, but it's not definite. So please don't implement it yet and don't tell your families. So schools are supposed to reopen on Monday, maybe. I don't know. So this goes back to hyperlocal. Betsy DeVos has nothing to do with this. This is not me defending Betsy DeVos. This is not telling me telling you to support Betsy DeVos. I'm telling you that Mayor Bill de Blasio and Governor Andrew Cuomo are having a contest to see which one of them can say chicken first, and that has nothing to do with the federal level. And that's the kind of thing where we are supposed to control for the local level.
That is insane. All of that is insane to figure out, parents trying to figure this out. And I think something similar happened in New York when they closed initially and were trying to decide whether or not they were opening at the beginning of the year. Parents were left with little or no information just days before the school was supposed to open and had no idea.
Right. And also parents were told you have to choose between the remote, all remote, or a hybrid learning plan, but they had no idea what hybrid was going to be. Was it once a week, twice a week, 3 times a week? You had to pick something without knowing what it was going to be. And this actually brings me back to your question. I do have a tendency to meander. This brings me back to the question, because you had started talking about unions. Mm-hmm. And a lot of the pushback to reopening schools is coming from the teachers' unions, from the principals' unions. So to be honest, I have, as you can tell, I have a lot of strong opinions. I really don't know what the right answer is here. I'm not pretending I do. I just know that a lot of the decisions are being made not about what's good for kids, but about what's good for the adults.
So there's a good question up right now that it's how do we as people who are electing local government officials, those local government officials are probably have constituents that are union members and also that are not. And they're also, like, say, for instance, the mayor or the governor or, the different folks that are interacting with teachers' unions. How do they walk that line and, balance their position between the goals of the union and the needs of the union and their demands, what's happening around schools, and adequately representing the constituents that put them in their offices to begin with, and looking out for kids and communities.
You got me there. I don't have an answer. Up to this point, I was doing really well. Things were coming. No, I genuinely don't know. I understand that people are beholden to the people who elected them. That's probably not the best aspect of American democracy, but I understand that. On the other hand, I do remember occasions where somebody may have been elected a Republican, and then once in office decided they were going to become a Democrat or an independent. I believe Joseph Lieberman went independent. So we do have some precedent for you being elected with one sort of set of, I don't want to say values because that's not true. It's not values, ideas, beliefs. You being elected with people thinking you support A, B, and C. And then once in office, I remember I was shocked to find out the first time that you could change affiliation and didn't have to restand for election again, because weren't you basically changing who you had been? So I think with that precedent, we might want to think about, yes, maybe you did get union money in order to be elected, but you weren't just elected to be a puppet, were you? You weren't just elected to sit there and talk like this. You were supposed to think for yourself. Also, situations change. The fact is, the union that elected you 3 years ago was not anticipating COVID-19. I mean, I'm constantly telling my kids every day to be flexible. The fact of the matter is, every time we tried to make any kind of future plans, it got to the point where I say to my kids, you know, things are changing every hour. Maybe we thought you're going back to school on Friday, but now you're not. And it's hard. And they're children. And I'm telling them, come on, we have to be flexible. That's just what it is. We can make plans with the understanding that anything could change at any moment. Well, if you were elected by a union to do something in particular, I think at this point, everything goes out the window when we're living in a pandemic. And it's one thing when teachers were saying, and this is an example, we don't want to work an extra 20 minutes per day in order to tutor or to call parents or do prep or whatever that is. And another thing, when there are kids who are getting no education at all and might only get that 20 minutes. So come on, the ground underneath us has shifted. This is not the situation and the world you were elected into. If you're just going to keep parroting what happened 3 years ago, well, that's just stupid. Notice how that sentence ran out of words at the end, but the best one I could come up with was, that's just stupid. We all have to adjust. We all are making it up as we go along. Why shouldn't politicians and union leaders?
And I couldn't imagine what it's like now. And I think of my own experience being a union leader and as president of my local union, if I was flexible and worked with administrators to get something done in maybe a little bit of an unorthodox way, but it checked everybody's boxes and nobody had to fight over it. There didn't have to be a grievance and everyone was happy. I would often get in trouble just because I chose to cooperate rather than to file a grievance. And I said, you know what, we're all in this ecosystem here together. And so flexibility is not great when it comes to union politics.
Yeah, and it keeps trickling down, because the fact of the matter is, you know, in order to authorize a strike vote, you have to go to the district leaders, and the district leaders have to go down to their constituency. So the fact of the matter is, I believe the majority of teachers, A, are overwhelmed because they're either not getting directives or getting 19 conflicting directives. The majority of teachers do want to do what's best for their student. But how many times have we heard cases? Was it just I apologize, I think it was out of Los Angeles, where teachers wanted to give extra time to students and their union told them, teachers at one school wanted to do. Remember when I talked, schools can actually make decisions on a really hyper-local level. I believe it was LA, but I'm not 100% sure, where teachers at one school wanted to add like 20 minutes or 30 minutes to their day that they could spend in individual tutorial with children who were falling through the cracks, who they saw were failing, and their union smacked them down. There was a school here in New York City, a school for, you know, at-risk kids. And the teachers all got together and they said, look, if we all agree to just teach one more class a day, we can make smaller classes, we can break up some cliques, we can get kids away from kids they shouldn't be near. So the whole school got together and each teacher agreed to just teach one more period per day. They presented their plan and the union told them no. So the fact is, I believe that most teachers want to do what's best for their students. But the union, as we started this conversation, is not there to serve the students. It's there to serve the broad membership.
As you're saying this, I could hear in my head all of the list of excuses for why you wouldn't be able to do something like that to help kids. And it goes from, teaching an extra class or having remedial time to even so much as doing a professional development or something like in the school district without being paid, without being compensated. That's not on your time. And the list of excuses goes on and on. But like you said, our teachers are so overwhelmed. And what I'm seeing out of New York is the same thing I'm seeing out of all of the other states, of the teachers that I'm seeing from all the states, where they really want to be doing a good job right now. And they're really frustrated and overwhelmed at the same time with changes and policies and expectations. So yeah, it's important to figure that out, where that all plays in, where the union plays in, and how your politician is going to balance that.
Well, we're also talking about the narrative. The narrative. I'm sorry to interrupt, but one of the things I wanted to add is the narrative that's coming in New York. Public school teachers are being told it is impossible to simultaneously teach remote and in the classroom students. The fact is the majority of private schools and charter schools are doing exactly that. Teachers are teaching to a 5 or 6 students in the classroom and students online. I know this. Actually, my husband is a teacher. He is doing that. And I know that there's many other teachers who are doing that. But the narrative is coming flat out. It's impossible. You can't ask a teacher to do that because it's impossible. And as I said, we have teachers who probably would like to try it because they realize somebody's getting underserved. But when you were being told over and over again, it's impossible, you certainly don't want any teachers to do that, because then that rips apart the it's impossible narrative.
Right. Right. I don't think we're seeing it in Pennsylvania as well. We're seeing teachers doing it very effectively in some of our places. And they are the technology that they've highlighted on their social media and how they're doing it and how they're managing it is really pretty phenomenal. People have figured this out and it can be done. Is it more difficult and stressful? Sure.
Of course.
Well,
my husband taught me the expression, actually, from when he worked in the tech field. He says, anytime you call IT and IT says it's impossible, translation, that means that would be hard and I'd have to put in an effort.
Yes. Not impossible, just difficult. We have to find somebody willing to help us do it. At this point in New York, I heard just like Pennsylvania last night, I was watching the debate, and I heard about how closed up and dying we all are in Pennsylvania and New York. And for those people that I'm watching on social media responding to those things, and I was one of them, saying that is not true. We are not locked down and closed up and dying here. And I saw New York people saying the same thing. Are schools safe right now? Is this something parents should be concerned about when it comes to COVID? Do you think, parents sending their kids to school, is it safe? Should teachers feel safe? Should principals feel safe going into schools?
A mantra we've been hearing over these many years is listen to the science, follow to the science. Are you a climate denier? Are you a science denier? Are you anti-vax? Listen to the science, listen to the science. All I'm seeing in the science is there's an infinitesimal number of cases that are happening in schools. The schools that have reopened, I don't have the numbers handy, but I think it was like less than 1% in the schools that were tested. So if it's all about follow the science, I'm not seeing science that says that it's dangerous to go into the school buildings. My husband is teaching every day. He is wearing a mask. He is wearing a mask to and from. He actually walks. He's not taking public transportation. So we're taking some precautions, but the science that I'm seeing, with, of course, the caveat, who knows, who is getting a kickback for what. I'm always open to anybody telling me that there's graft and corruption, because sure, I believe there's graft and corruption. I believe somebody's sitting on numbers. But if the mantra is follow the science we're seeing is that reopening school buildings and having children and teachers in them is not more dangerous than a lot of other activities. Restaurants are open, some gyms are partially being open, schools are not. I'm not seeing that in the science.
Right. Good to know. And that's a lot of the balking about the teachers' unions and their position and their narrative too, right, is about safety. So we need to compare those things. So all of these things we've talked, there's so many, and there's so many people that people need to be paying attention to. Is there anything on this particular ballot this November that New York parents dealing with some level of schooling should be paying attention to?
Not anything that will affect their life directly. The really big thing parents should be thinking about, because it's going to affect every aspect of schooling, is next year's mayoral election. Bill de Blasio has hit his term limits. He cannot run again. We have a couple of people right now who have sort of announced for mayor, some of them from his administration, but interestingly enough, all of the candidates from his administration are really separating themselves from him. He is not a popular guy. You know, remember when he was polling 0 nationwide in the presidency? He's not that much higher right now in New York. So some people are from his administration, some people are from the city council, the controller. The fact is, it's all sort of entrenched political people, but the really big questions, if you are concerned about schools, you want to know, where do they stand on school rezoning? Where do they stand on more or fewer charter schools? Where do they stand on expanding or shrinking gifted and talented programs? Where do they stand on screening for middle and high school? Where do they stand on the specialized high school exam? Where do they stand on ICT classrooms and special needs funding and dual language programs and all of that? So it's an umbrella. As I mentioned at the top, you know, the borough president appoints some people, and the state has some control over some aspects, but really mayoral control means mayoral control. It would also be nice if it meant mayoral responsibility, but that's something that we can discuss perhaps in another hour, some other day. But mayoral control, so you get the most bang for your buck by really focusing on who is running for mayor. But also, I want people tend to not pay much attention to borough president, but borough president with their appointments does have quite a bit of influence also on educational policy, which ultimately all the way has to go up to the mayor. The fact is, on the panel for education policy, the majority of the seats are appointees of the mayor. So it still keeps coming back to the mayor. But looking more intensely than I think people have in the past, I think they should be looking at borough president and city council as well, because even decisions that city council doesn't have control over, city council has some say in. And let's not forget, mayoral control needs to be renewed in Albany regularly. The last bit of mayoral control was only for a year. So it's not outside the realm of possibility that the state will take mayoral control away from the mayor, and then it does go to city council and people like that. So I like to be extremely conservative in that sense, you know, cover all your bases. Yes, the mayor is in charge now, but the possibility that the mayor might not be in charge later. So you want to know who's going to be on city council. And the fact of the matter is, there's certainly no harm in both of them agreeing with what you agree with. But right now, I'd say the big battle is a year from now and the mayoral election, because the new mayor is going to be able to have quite a bit of influence on quite a bit of educational policy, starting at UPK, which was Bill de Blasio's initiative, which, by the way, keep in mind, universal pre-K was Bill de Blasio's baby. It's currently over budget and undersubscribed. It is very strongly possible that the next mayoral candidate may come in and say, well, I'd rather take that money for my baby, whatever my pet project is going to be. So keep that in mind as well. There are initiatives that the new mayor may decline to fund. It's not like when something is in, it's eternal. So for instance, if you're starting at the really lower level, UPK, if you believe UPK should be available, and 3PK, or if you believe it's actually a waste of money, that's definitely going to be under the mayor's control.
Wow. So it's, in a way, it's kind of good news, because there's so much to pay attention to, and there's still some time to learn about.
That's great. We'll just keep saying this. We'll just rerun this every day, and hopefully by next year's election, people go, yeah, mayor, borough president, I should pay attention to that.
Right. So there's time, and we're not right up against, against the wire right now. And that's really great news. And I want to just kind of, to close today, bring it back to how we opened with DeVos. And, yes, it's not a great idea to be hyper focused on the federal level, but how has that actually been a benefit?
The focus on the federal level? Mm-hmm. Oh, it's been terrific. It's been wonderful, because suddenly people are saying to me, hey, did you know that over 50% of New York students aren't performing at grade level? Yes, I did know that. Did you know that a little less than half of New York City high school seniors are graduating not college ready? Yes, I did know that. So here is the thing. I am very pleased with the focus on DeVos because it's forcing people who never before cared about educational issues, but if they can say something bad about Betsy DeVos and Donald Trump, they're going to get really, really passionate about it, and they're going to dive in, and they're going to find out that the state of education in America is really, really bad. And then they're going to maybe do something about it by voting at the local level. So yes, the light that is shown, the light that is shined on the federal is bound to trickle down. And that I'm very excited about.
Right. I think that's probably a great place to wrap it up for today, because it gives us a little bit of hope and a little bit of time to impact those local elections. So I want to thank you so much for being here today. And you have taught me a tremendous amount of things about New York education today. So I appreciate that. I'm sure our viewers do too. And do you have any parting words for our voters this time around?
Just pay attention. One of the things that I like to say is I have never voted a straight party ticket in my life, and I don't intend to. Don't just vote by rote because this is how you've always voted. Really read what's there and really find out what people are doing, because you might be surprised to find that people don't think what you think they're supposed to think based on things that you've thought in the past. So please vote by really looking at what's at stake.
Wonderful. All right. Thank you so much. And we'll have to have you back again soon.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right.